hi neighbor, what do you know and what do you say? Hi neighbor, throw all your worries away today. Come on and shake my hand and let a grin do the rest. It makes you feel so grand to get your chin off your chest. I'm shouting, hi neighbor, my neighbor, time to play and say hi.
Hi, neighbor. This is Alan Vance. I am the originator and host of the Voice of One Crying podcast. This podcast attempts to explore the intersection of faith and culture. Regardless of our nomenclature for faith, we all have some underlying faith or philosophical construct. Regardless of our nomenclature for culture, we all live in culture. Our underlying faith construct or philosophical construct continuously informs and influences our interface with culture. That's what this podcast is all about. Please share this podcast with others. Invite them to listen. I would be more than pleased for any response, reply, or inquiry from you. Feel free to contact me at vox.crying@gmail.com. The music which opens and closes this podcast is an homage to my father-in-law. Among other things, he was a devoted and accomplished participant in the world of barbershop harmony. He sang in championship quartets and directed championship choruses. He was a well-known and popular entertainer in that world in which he had a storied career. The songs for this podcast are from the International Champion Quartet Oriole 4, in which he sang. These songs are not simply homages, they sync with the theme of his podcast. My underlying faith construct is evangelical Christianity. As such, the life, ministry, and teachings of Jesus are central to how I try to live my life. One of the great commandments that he articulated was to love one's neighbor as oneself. Since, in the teaching of Jesus, our neighbor is anyone to whom we extend neighborly love, the song, Hi Neighbor, seems appropriate. The song which closes out the podcast syncs with the promise of Jesus that as we move through our lives, seeing ourselves as being on mission as his representatives in the world, he will be with us always. The promise is that he will never leave us nor forsake us. Hence, wherever I wander or roam, I have the confidence and control of his presence. Thus, the song, Anywhere I Wander, seems appropriate. Welcome to the first edition of this podcast. I was born in 1959, so I was a young child in the decade of the 1960s. I can remember the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. I certainly remember seeing the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Animals, the Mamas and the Papas, and many other 1960s era entertainers from various genres on the Ed Sullivan Show. I also saw the Beatles at Shea Stadium. My brother was 20 months older than me, but only a year ahead of me in school. We were very much aware of things that were happening in the culture around us, and we regularly watched the nightly news with our parents. As such, an interest in culture was formed in me at a relatively young age, and that interest has continued throughout the years of my life. Every one of us is part of culture. Our interface and relationship to the surrounding culture is, in large measure, influenced by our underlying faith or philosophical construct. Likewise, our underlying faith or philosophical construct is often a function of our culture. Whether we see ourselves in the context of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, various animisms, some version of agnosticism or atheism, or whatever. Our faith construct is often related to the culture in which we have been raised. The purpose of this podcast is not necessarily to discuss or debate an apologia for one faith system as opposed to another. Rather, it is to explore how culture and faith intersect and influence one another. I am an evangelical Christian, and I believe in the truth claims which underlie evangelical faith. But my purpose here is not to set forth the case for evangelicalism. My thinking as I interface with culture will, of necessity, be influenced by my evangelical faith, but I'm endeavoring to explore faith and culture from a broader perspective. Each human being was born with and lives out of a set of circumstances which are completely beyond his or her control. Whether those circumstances be biologically or genetically imposed, such as native intelligence, our basic psycho-emotional construct, our physical potentialities, etc., or whether they be environmental factors which, coupled with our biological genetic parameters, either enhance or curtail our formation as being fully realized and actualized in relation to our potential. The fact is, we are who we are and who our potential and formation enables us to be. The nature versus nurture argument has a long history, and people adhere to various gradations along the scale between the two extremes. While I freely acknowledge that a second child is raised in a quote unquote different environment than is a first child, simply by fact that the older child is part of the environment, I can also speak anecdotally that my two children are very different from one another and have been from their earliest years. Despite their mothers and my efforts to raise them in fundamentally the same way as related to values, opportunities, and formation, we were required to make multiple adjustments over the years as respecting each child's aptitudes, interests, personalities, and ways of experiencing the world. The common goal in raising both children was to propel them toward becoming fully realized and actualized people in accordance with who they were and are at their respective foundations. To the nature versus nurture discussion, I reply with a resounding yes. For any of us, these biogenetic and environmental factors are utterly beyond our control to form and or fabricate. For instance, I was born and raised in the northeast suburb of Baltimore. My upbringing occurred in the 1960s and 1970s in largely white America. My parents were hardworking. We were not wealthy, but my brother and I never worried about whether we were going to have food to eat or adequate clothes to wear. My parents, like many others, sacrificed some of their pleasures so that my brother and I were enabled to pursue our passions. We both played sports and achieved some measure of success in those arenae. We were both reasonably capable academically, and our parents insisted and demanded that our schoolwork remain up to par with our abilities, or they would withhold extracurricular activities. We were involved in vocal music. My future father-in-law was my ninth grade chorus instructor. We had a lot of curiosity about things around us, like the music scene. Early favorites were Steppenwolf, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and Chicago. We were interested in political campaigns. The 1964 Goldwater Johnson, the 1968 Humphrey Nixon, the 1972 Nixon McGovern, the 1976 Carter Ford, Maryland gubernatorial, senatorial, and representative elections. We were interested in political movements, civil rights, women's rights, etc. We were intrigued and astonished by Vietnam. A neighbor died as part of that conflict. Watergate captured our interest, as did other cultural events. We attended a full range of athletic events, such as the Baltimore, Washington area afforded, including Major League Baseball, the Baltimore Orioles, NFL football, the Baltimore Colts, NBA basketball, the Baltimore Bullets, minor league hockey, the Baltimore Clippers, and later the Baltimore Skipjacks, and various iterations of professional soccer, the Baltimore Bays, the Baltimore Comets, the Washington Darts, the Washington Stars, and later the Baltimore Blast. We were stunned and saddened by the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Even as a 4-year-old, I have memories of his death and funeral. Also, the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy shocked us. We were aware of and impacted by the murder of Medgar Evers, the killing of the Freedom Riders in Mississippi, and the assassination of Malcolm X. In addition, the space race culminating in the Apollo 11 moon landing fascinated and inspired us. I relate this context because it was and remains part of who I am as a person. These experiences were formative. Part of my understanding is that each one of us is, at present, the sum of everything that has gone into forming us as a person. This doesn't mean that we can never become more than what we are presently. The formation continues as we have new experiences, which are coupled with an openness and humility to learn and thereby make subtle or not so subtle adjustments to our underlying construct. None of us knows everything. To put it in biblical terms, despite the best of our efforts, we see through a glass darkly. I have lots of letters in front of and behind my name. I am an ordained minister who has served in pastoral ministry for 30 years. I have 3 academic degrees, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD, which represent more than 10 years of post-high school education. I have taught college courses for more than 16 years and counting. I am a mentor for doctoral students. But this doesn't mean that I cannot or should not embrace the humility by which I can learn something important from virtually anyone with whom I engage. I can experience ongoing formation as I allow the wisdom, knowledge, experience, and hope of others to impact and supplement my own. In microcosm, this is my ongoing intersection of faith and culture. I am influenced by others, and I influence others. John Donne declared that no man is an island. We are part of the whole. If that is true, and I believe it is, and my faith tells me that it is, then I am perpetually engaged in the never-ending interplay between myself and the culture in which I live. In the middle of the 20th century, a Christian thinker named Richard Niebuhr wrote a book in which he set forth a series of models which characterized how followers of Christ orient themselves in relation to culture. In this book, which became something of an instant classic, Niebuhr drew upon his knowledge of Scripture and his knowledge of Christian history to identify the different ways that throughout history, members of the body of Christ express the intersection of faith and culture. Niebuhr's model still possesses a measure of validity. However, over the second half of the 20th century, culture has undergone continuing changes which have necessitated continuing consideration on the part of the faithful to respond to those ongoing changes. Much of the writing leading up to the turn of the century and subsequent to the advent of the 21st century has sought to provide cogent responses to the question of the intersection and relationship between the culture and the follower of Christ. Largely focused on the gathered assembly of the saints, many people have written various articles and books in which they have made numerous suggestions, ranging from those who have advocated for highly traditional expressions to those who have advocated for a greater embrace of culture, with the hope that these expressions would resonate with culture. Whether one leans towards traditional forms, which include things like smells and bells, or one leans towards more avant-garde expressions, which might include smoke and mirrors, the common goal endeavors to meaningfully and faithfully consider how the faithful Christ follower interfaces with a culture in a way that reflects faith and offers a meaningful representation of the person and work of Christ. It is my hope that this podcast might be able to explore this intersection and interplay between faith and culture. We are all engaged in the process of how we respond to the pressures of culture and the demands of faith. Whether our faith is a clearly defined and articulated set of formulae and beliefs, or our faith is simply a general sense of the way things are. Whether our engagement with culture is intentional and active, or we simply take things as they come and react or respond to them, the reality is that we are always living in the intersection of faith and culture. Going forward, in addition to providing some of my thoughts and reactions regarding culture, I intend to present interviews from people of various faith perspectives. These faith perspectives will not be limited to Christian faith, although they will include individuals across the spectrum of Christian faith and denomination. My intent and hope is to present interviews from people who also represent non-Christian faiths, as well as those who hold to no faith, but whose philosophy informs their view of culture. I hope you will find this podcast informative and thought-provoking. Please plan to join me in this exploration by listening and offering responses and/or questions. Invite someone else to listen as well. Thank you for joining me on the Voice of One Crying podcast. I hope you will be a regular listener. There will be a new podcast posted each Monday morning by 9 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time. Please invite your friends to listen. Also, please feel free to contact me at vox.crying@gmail.com. That's VOX dot CRYING at gmail.com. Comments and inquiries are welcome. Also, if there's an issue regarding faith and culture that may be of interest to you, please feel free to share your thoughts with me. Who knows? It may become the basis of a future podcast. Again, thanks for listening.
Anywhere